Man, these guys actually knew the apostles? That's wild. So last week on the Wednesday lesson, we did an overview of the early church fathers, and we broke them into 4 main categories. Unfortunately, these videos aren't going to be so tidy. There's a major church event that takes place like right in between all of it, and that needs to be covered before I can finish up the church fathers. But today we're going to stick to the tidy category of Apostolic Fathers. If you remember from the last video, they're called that because these people actually studied with the apostles. Yeah, those apostles. And I think that's pretty exciting. Not only do we have the apostles who actually wrote the Bible, but we have writings from a generation of people who studied with the apostles. First, let's start off with a man named Clement of Rome. As his name suggests, he eventually became the bishop at the church in Rome. And he's actually mentioned in the Bible. Not a big part, but in Philippians 4, as the Apostle Paul is doing his normal salutations, he mentions Clement. And I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, help those women which labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and with other my fellow laborers whose names are written in the book of life. He glosses over some women who helped him, some other people that he calls fellow laborers, but he singles out Clement, who apparently had something to do with the Philippian church, but is best known for his time in Rome, where he studied under the Apostle Peter. Church tradition has both the apostles Paul and Peter founding the Church of Rome. And even though that's not mentioned in the Bible, some of the earliest witnesses have that recorded. So it seems likely that Clement studied under Peter and Paul. Clement was ordained by Peter and became the 2nd or 3rd bishop in Rome. The timeline's funny. There may be a guy named Linus in there somewhere. But either way, there are several writings that may or may not be written by him, but there's one that's definitely his that's called First Clement. And it's a letter to the Corinthian church. And it appears that some of the problems that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church about were still a problem in Clement's day. Listen to what he writes. Love admits no schisms. Love gives rise to no seditions. Love does all things in harmony. It sounds like he was very familiar with Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and used the same kind of language to encourage them against internal division. Legend says that he was martyred by the Romans in the year 99 AD by being tied to an anchor and dropped into the ocean. That can't be right. Yep, that's right. Now on to some shorter overviews of the next few guys. Polycarp was a man who was a disciple of the Apostle John. John left him in charge of the church at Smyrna. So in the book of Revelation, when John says that Jesus has messages for 7 churches in Asia, and he writes a letter to the church at Smyrna, he was probably writing to Polycarp. In fact, it's probably reasonable to assume that Polycarp was one of the first people to ever read the book of Revelation. The address to Smyrna isn't negative like some of the other addresses to the churches. John writes, "Fear none of these things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death." This text would have been a great comfort to Polycarp, who was eventually martyred. At his trial, where the Roman proconsul was trying to get him to sacrifice to Roman gods, he said this, 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king and savior? He was burned at the stake then and there. Almost done. Another figure from that time was Ignatius of Antioch. He also studied with John and knew our last guy Polycarp. And it seems like he either knew or was known by Peter, because a historian about 100 years later said that Peter left specific instructions that Ignatius be made bishop at the church in Antioch. He was martyred, supposedly in the Roman Colosseum, by being thrown to lions. But on the way from Antioch to his execution in Rome, he had time to write a whole bunch of letters to churches that we still have today. And he even wrote a letter to his old friend Polycarp. The last church father I'll mention today, very briefly, was a friend of both Polycarp and Ignatius, a man named Papias. He also studied under the Apostle John. I'm honestly not sure why so many of John's disciples have surviving writings when so many others don't. He was the leader of the church in Hierapolis, and he shed some really early light on how the Gospels were written. For example, he mentions that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark while he was traveling with Peter, Mark using Peter's eyewitness testimony to write the Gospel. However, concerning the rest of Papias' written works, a church historian named Eusebius, who lived about 100 years later, said this: Papias appears to have been of very limited understanding. Brutal! So that's a little bit about the earliest Christians outside of the apostles. Next week we'll be digging into the ante-Nicene Fathers. So from everyone involved with the Order of Eden, thanks for watching. I hope it was a blessing, and I'll see you in the next one.